Welcome back, everyone. Today I wanted to give my full review of Diablo 4, and after playing a little bit too much of it and Bobby lighting the world on fire for the launch, it's been a wild ride so far and has been insanely hyped with the nostalgia trip and the insane marketing, showing that Diablo 4 isn't just meant to be another ARPG, but it's meant to be the biggest game Activision Blizzard has ever released. Making $666 million in the first week, breaking their own records, was really impressive, and it shows that they couldn't have marketed this game any better. But I don't think they just went all out because it's Blizzard's baby, but it's because it's the last game they'll ever release as Activision Blizzard before they get bought out by Microsoft. And that's why the deeper I dive, the more I feel like something's missing. But for you to understand that perspective, I have to catch you up on everything Activision's been up to since Diablo 4 started its development. And we're going to go all the way back to its announcement on November 1st, 2019, with a massive gameplay and video trailer that would blow up, getting everyone excited for the unannounced release date, showing that they took heavy inspiration on the open world from Lost Ark, which soft launched on November 7th, 2018 into an open beta. It was the first game of its kind to have an open world where you could see other players running around in it, and it brought the whole world to life in a way other ARPGs had failed to do for years. And with the overwhelming positive feedback Lost Ark was getting, Diablo 4 needed to have all of it for itself, and showed it off in its early gameplay trailer. But everything would go silent for almost 2 years after this because of a troubled development cycle with internal struggles at Blizzard, where Diablo 4 would see its game director and lead level designer both leave because of the sexual misconduct lawsuit against Activision Blizzard, and have a full employee walkout on July 28, 2021, calling for the CEO Bobby Cockdick to be removed because it wasn't being taken seriously enough. Even Cockdick himself said he knew about the allegations for years but failed to take action. And in a more recent interview, he said that basically none of this was true. But everything you hear about him is all negative outside of his own words, so you would think he would be gone by now. With so many scandals under his belt, he's even appeared in Epstein's Black Book, but somehow he still manages to be the CEO in 2023. And that's because even though Bobby's been a bad boy, Bobby makes a lot of money, and his business acumen is almost completely unmatched. And it really shows that Activision's only priority is money, and they're making a lot of it. But we've done a massive time skip to this year, and don't worry, they've been busy with people getting hacked on Call of Duty and the cancellation of Overwatch 2's original concept that never even really existed in the first place. You start to understand that all of what they say can't be trusted. And if you've been playing Blizzard games for a while, you know that time with them is always just going to be a flat circle. Which takes us to the closed beta tests that were extremely well received outside of the dungeons. And after playing all of the betas, I think backtracking is just as bad, even though they said they would fix it for launch. And if you missed out on that early access launch, you probably had to wait for Nightmare dungeon buffs to hit level 100 if you were playing solo because of all the nerfs. And really showed that putting that extra cash up whenever Blizzard's going to launch a new game is going to get you in on the best exploits. Because when they cut half the elites out of the game, it made the solo loop a nightmare. And after 3 weeks of just nerfing everything into the ground, they got so much pushback that they had to start buffing everything. With teasers from the Campfire that didn't address a lot of the core issues with the gameplay loop outside of experience gains, it takes us all the way to June 27th just to get the EXP patch in to fix it. I personally don't see why the experience couldn't have been changed sooner when they nerfed the amount of elites and then the port added later, but it's basically caught us up to everything Diablo 4 and Blizzard's been up to, outside of the Campfire that's coming up later this week that'll give us more information on Season 1. So now I'm going to go over a lot of positives and negatives about the game with my experience at the endgame. And just understand that a lot of the issues I have now are going to be your problems in the very near future, with Season 1 being only a couple of weeks away, where you are going to be forced to start a new character to participate in all of the endgame systems if you want to see Diablo 4's newest content. And the seasonal drama wasn't something I was expecting, but the Campfire basically confirmed that most of the player base hadn't even finished the story at that point, which I'll assume most people have now, as I see a lot of people starting to get to level like 90 and 100, but it really goes to show how far the marketing really went for this game, attracting a whole new audience. And that's also where I see a massive disconnect in the classic ARPG community and the newcomers, because when you start the game and go 1 to 60, you'll probably feel really good about everything in Diablo 4. The story is fairly well done. I think the real problem with it was just overhyped, and anything that has that much build-up is always just going to feel disappointing, and I think a lot of people got swept away with that. I would say the only weird part about the whole thing was fighting a Shava solo, because it's a world boss, but they're dying in 30 seconds now anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And the world really gives you the same vibe as Lost Ark that feels truly alive when you see other players randomly running around doing things with you. And you start to see the inspiration from it all across Diablo 4, just in a much darker way. So when you combine that with the epic music from all the different events and bosses with the character sounds, it helps immerse you even deeper. And with the marketing basically having no budget with the Diablo 4 anthem and the other things across the world, like a music video for one of Joel and Sai's old songs and a live action trailer in Brazil, you start seeing how much work they did just to get eyes on Diablo 4. I really want to double down on the fact that there was a whole bunch of marketing a lot of us haven't even seen. But it didn't just stop with a pre-launch of hype. After they launched, having Megan Fox read death quotes on Twitter was probably one of the coolest things I've seen a game do in a long time.
Oh, your face was melted off in a painful blast of hellfire I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. You will forever be remembered for your smile.
And it really helps you feel the scale of everything they're trying to do and pulls you in even more, attracting every kind of player to want to give it a try, irrelevant if you're new or old to ARPGs. I think all of this combined got everyone insanely hyped for 1 to 60. The problem is once you start going past that from 60 to 80 is where you start to experience the drag of a lot of the systems. And the more you use the UI, you get the feeling it wasn't exactly made for Diablo 4 and was more of an afterthought than anything else. Then you start getting introduced to scaling in the unstoppable immune meta, where you're always fighting monsters that CC you to death rather than flat out kill you, because almost every enemy you fight has a built-in CC, so when they get bonus CC, fun as hat. Then the magical journey from 80 to 100, even after the EXP buffs, rips you out of your immersion almost completely and starts feeling very discouraging as a solo player because of scaling and overall progression with the endgame systems that constantly remove you from the game, forcing you to use external websites to track events and build your character out correctly. And right as you start pushing your character, you start feeling weaker because of the scaling. At about level 85, if you know what to look for, you'll basically be in full perfect gear, and that's kind of where your power level stops, unless you keep re-rolling to get perfect stats. And you end up needing so much gold just to gain power that you end up picking up everything just to vendor it all because it's the only decent way to make money, making events, Tree of Whispers, Nightmare Dungeons, and World bosses almost completely irrelevant for this and waste a massive world that they laid out for us, forcing you into farming the same basic dungeons of whatever has the most elite density to get as much gold as possible, which degenerates the gameplay loop by pushing you away from doing fun and cool events. But just to clarify, I don't actually dislike the massive gold cost of everything. I just don't like where you're funneled to get gold. Even they said at the last Campfire they wanted to move away from things like that, but with all the nerfs and buffs they've done, it's just promoting a more degenerative gameplay experience for the entire game. And while leveling might have gotten a lot easier with those EXP buffs, they also needed to buff the gold values of those things as well, and that's probably the next thing we're going to see, because this is something a lot more people are going to be complaining about as they push into the first season. And I think they need to put more emphasis on doing fun and challenging content rather than mindless. And with the EXP buffs, you just end up getting weaker faster because you're not gaining gear. And I think the whole problem here is that you don't end up chasing items like a traditional ARPG, but you're always just chasing after a reroll, and that doesn't feel very rewarding. And I also don't count the super rare and possible to get uniques as items in the game to even plan building around. They might as well not even exist with their current drop rate, and I don't actually think these uniques are good for the game. If you think about how long it takes to get them, it's been about a month and we've only seen one of each been reported, but they're rare enough that most people are very excited to post them. So you're probably looking at anywhere between 300 and 500 hours just to get that, and most people outside of streamers will not play more than 200 in a season. So you got to think, if you're only going to get one of these every third season, you might not even get the one that you want, so you can't even count them as chase items. And I did see a couple theories that the game is built around World Tier 5 in Season 1, where you'll have access to this thing that lets you boost everything you're getting from 15 to 20%, but I still don't think it solves a lot of those core issues with the end game. And I think that that focus on couch co-op should stop after level 60 when the campaign is over. It's amazing for that specifically, but it starts degrading the end game experience outside of that. And I think the best way to fix that is to stop the world from scaling past capstone dungeons outside of events. So World Tier 4 would stop at level 70 and all of the drop loot would be level 70 as well, so that way trading opens up. Then all the Hell Tides, Tree of Whispers, and random world events would still scale 3 levels above you, so you're in the perfect EXP threshold, but push towards doing fun things with other people instead of an endless base dungeon grind. And they absolutely do need to buff the gold values of these things to make them relevant, so that way it brings people together and helps bring the world back to life, because right now Helltides and PvP zones are the only things with a perfect balance outside of event gold, and expanding other systems around them would be the perfect short-term fix. And maybe a lot of this stuff will be eventually balanced out with World Tier 5, but for now, if that World Tier 5 doesn't come out, a lot of classes just end up in glyph power dead zones because of the scaling. After you get the gear cap, the only way to get power is either to reroll or to have a proper Paragon board set up so you don't fall off. More specifically, the correct glyphs for your class. If you end up using the wrong ones, you end up basically being a wet pool noodle, but some classes can go 3 to 5 levels before you hit that threshold to give you enough power to deal with everything that you're fighting. And the whole system just ends up being an annoying push and pull until you max out all your glyphs at level 100, and it ends up removing you from the game to use it properly by forcing you to that external website to set your character up so you don't fall off. And in most cases, you just copy someone else's build because it's a lot of work to put all this together. I really think they do have to add an in-game way to preview and theory craft Paragon board setup, and maybe save like a preset path or something that ticks up as you go. But I don't like being removed from the game to theory craft something like this. And a faster way to remove boards needs to be added too, like right-clicking a gate or something to break everything past it will go a really long way in making this feel way better. And I think adding a preset for a second spec isn't a bad idea either, so you could have an Uber and a farming build. I've seen a lot of arguments for and against respecs, and I do like tailoring my character to do one thing specifically and have it being special at that. But right now, it's already extremely easy to swap your build around. It just costs gold and time the higher level you are. I also have to give them credit for having so many viable endgame builds for every character. Most ARPGs have never pulled that off in their entire lifespan, so seeing every character at least be able to complete the hardest content is refreshing, and being able to go between 2 and 3 builds per character to do at least most of the game is a good thing. A lot of aspects basically create a set bonus that's not green, so as they expand it, I hope it gets more in depth and better. What I don't like about them is that they focus on pushing you into build or spend a meta for every single character, and I think they need to break out of the mindset of needing mediocre skills to make builds work. And I think a big step in that direction is making ultimates not part of the main bar. Some classes don't even take them because they just aren't good, and ultimates should never feel that way. They should also never limit your build options. Lost Ark really showed us that having ultimates on a separate bind altogether makes the game way more dynamic. So doing this would open up the game even more and create more interesting and fun builds, especially when we look at the absolute endgame of trying to beat a level 100 Nightmare Sigil and Uber Lilith, where things get even more limited. And I think Uber Lilith is insanely well done. I personally haven't gotten to experience yet because I have all of 1 FPS in her room for some reason, and I've seen a lot of people have more performance issues as patches go on, but this is a personal problem, and I'm not going to fault Uber Lilith at all for this in any way, shape, or form. I think over time it'll eventually get better because I really like having a challenge boss waiting for you at level 100. They really did do an amazing job on the cinematic aspect of the fight with all the camera shifts and phases, and continuing to add cool and fun challenge bosses like this that are high quality will only make the game better and better. It's one of the reasons Lost Ark ended up being successful in the first place. The Legion raids were something truly special, and I'm happy they captured it visually in Diablo 4. It's just unfortunate that they didn't take the functional half. Add a baseline separate invincibility frame and CC break dodges would solve a lot of the endgame problems in Diablo 4. When you do play Lost Ark, and I know I'm referencing it quite a bit, but there's so much influence from it in the game that it's important to talk about what actually made it good. And on higher pings, it helps you dodge a lot of mechanics and helps prevent desync. And currently with Diablo 4's version of it, it's just a movement skill that gets desync back into any CC that you try to avoid, and genuinely feels pretty terrible to use. But I also understand that with +3 dodges, this would just be a ridiculous iframe fiesta, so I think that would end up having to be removed. But after feeling how smooth it made a game with so much CC feel, I know it would make Diablo 4's entire experience way cleaner. And it would help build diversity quite a bit by not forcing you into an unstoppable spam just so you don't get CC'd to death. And almost every build that doesn't revolve around crit damage, vulnerable, CDR, and armor ends up falling off way too quickly and feeling worthless. Plus, if you don't have good vulnerable application, it just makes your character feel bad, because once you start pushing into those higher tier nightmare dungeons and start experiencing the one-shot fiesta they become, that static difficulty starts becoming something that works against them rather than with them. And I do think that the static scaling of Nightmare Dungeons is good until it outscales you and makes your defensive stats feel completely irrelevant. And the more that you push into the Nightmare Dungeons, the more their systems start falling apart. The best way to get high level keys is just to mindlessly farm level 50s of the best maps and just disenchant the rest of them, then craft a high level key. But the range is 10 levels with random affixes, and most of the time the dungeons are flat out impossible with some of the mobs at level 150 plus, so there's too many layers of RNG involved in just getting a decent sigil, to the point that I just gave up at about level 78 because I wasn't having fun with the system anymore, and I'm pretty much chalked until season 1 at this point. It really just got boring to farm level 50s over and over again to just try and get lucky crafting something I actually wanted or could do. But at least the quality of life port to the Nightmare Dungeons was a nice addition. I just don't think moving to them was the actual problem. A lot of the systems around Nightmare Dungeons just aren't good altogether. The crafting of them needs to be more specific, letting you craft the exact number you want, And all the backtracking really needs to go. They said they were going to fix it, and they never actually did. And after you've done like 30 or 40 of them in one day, it just starts feeling like a walking simulator. And it doesn't help that a lot of the events you come across just end up 1-minute chores that aren't worth doing. But the real nightmare part of these sigils isn't actually doing them, it's managing them in your inventory. Inventory management in Diablo 4 is probably the worst feature out of everything in the game, because eventually your stash starts looking like this, and it's just annoying again to have to hover over every single thing just to find what you need. The only saving grace for the sigils is when you sort, it puts some of them beside each other so you can run that same dungeon over and over again. But it really just needs to have its own tab at the Occultist where you can craft and disenchant them. Kind of like a map tab on PoE, just Diablo-fied. And I won't be surprised if Blizzard drops something like sigil and aspect tabs into the cash shop. Inventory management is one of the biggest drawbacks about Diablo 4, and aspects don't help with that. While you're gearing, you always want to save 2 to 3 backups just in case you get a slightly better piece or you want to swap your gear around, which eventually leads to mules, and that's just not healthy for the game. Again, the Occultist seems like the perfect solution for the aspects too, because she already has a library of them, so I don't see why we can't just feed the ones that we get to her so she always has the highest one that we've extracted so that we always get the maximum power out of them. It doesn't really feel good to have to keep dropping the same item over and over again and hold on to so many of them. I think if they did those two things, the stash not having a search button wouldn't feel nearly as bad, but adding that in the current state is probably the easiest fix, because hovering over every single thing just to find what you need while being so limited on space just needs to go. It's an artificial playtime inflation that I'm actually starting to think wasn't by accident, and all of this was almost done on purpose. Inventory management isn't fun in any way, and it just keeps you in game longer. And all these small little decisions and things just keep adding up to more and more artificial playtime inflation, degenerating the gameplay loop massively, making me feel like it only wants to have me in game as long as possible for the chance that I click on the shop, rather than keeping me rewarded and me having fun to be in the game. And I think that's doubled down by not including Blue Quest in the Renown update for when seasons are active. I can get behind redoing the dungeons and doing new ones to finish his own reputation off, just not redoing side quests. They should really shift the focus to farming cool and fun things like the dungeons, or tie farming cosmetics into the Renown grind every season so it doesn't feel like a chore and you actually want to do it for more sideways progression. And it's the perfect opportunities to make mount armor and trophies have a special effect, like being able to break through barricades in the open world, so you want to go farm these things out so you feel rewarded for doing them. It won't stop the random hitching on everything that you experience when you're on your horse, but at least you would feel good breaking down the barricade. And all of this stuff combined is kind of what made it so difficult for me to do a Diablo 4 review, because behind all the magic of the world they created, everything just feels like it's hollow, almost like it's a shell waiting to be filled up. Because the early game 1 to 60 campaign and introduction is a solid 8 out of 10 experience. There's no denying that. You really do get taken away by the grand spectacle that they made out of Diablo 4. And when I imagine it from the POV of someone who doesn't usually play games, it would actually be magical. And that's why I hope I painted the entire picture for you of why we see such a disconnect between the new audience and the old audience that's been with Blizzard for so long. Because that mid-game of 60 to 80 is an easy 5 out of 10 experience because of a lot of the things that we talked about. And the end game of 80 to 100 is an astounding 2 out of 10. Uber Lilith is all of those 2 points, by the way. I think she's very well done, and if the entire end game was her, it would just be a 9 out of 10. But she's not, and the rest of the end game discourages you from progressing your character to be as strong as possible, and that's what an RPG is all about. So that's why Diablo 4 isn't necessarily a bad game, it's just not a good game. It's just right in the middle as average, which is a lot better than I can say about most games that are coming now these days. Some launches can honestly just be unforgivable. But I do think Diablo 4 does have amazing core fundamentals to build off of, so we'll have to wait and see if Blizzard ever does anything special with it, because it all really comes back around to how focused they are on that artificial playtime inflation. It might just be that the endgame was unfinished with that Season 1 active, so we'll have to wait and see at this week's Campfire and the actual launch of it, but with how disconnected the top of Blizzard is from what actually retains its players on its other games, time may be a flat circle once again. And we know who's at the top of Blizzard, which is why the deeper I dive into Diablo 4, the more I feel like it has no soul. So that's going to be all for now, and I hope you all have a great night.